come back and watch it later. So thanks. I'm excited to have such a good crowd. We're really excited to share what we've got to tell you today. These are some of the messages from this handbook, the SEI handbook, that Warren and I have just self-published, and that we're in the process of making it so you can order a hard copy through Amazon. But right now you can read it all online, and it's all open source and available for free at that URL on the lower left. That URL will be on all the slides, but do write that down and feel free to take a look. This is what we'll be sharing today are the messages from one portion of that. Just before I jump in, just a couple of ground rules. I think most of you were here when I said, please do mute your mic when you're not speaking, just in case you've got a background noise or phone call or something like that. But we will pause a few times for people to introduce themselves and share their own experiences and find out who's on the call. And we're going to actually go to that next. So, because this particular topic can appeal to a lot of different types of people, we want to get a sense of who's on the call. So either through audio or through the chat. I'll let you decide depending on what your sort of local tech is. Tell us who you are, your name, your institution, and what is your role? Like, what is it that brought you here? What about your job brought you here today? So I'm going to pause for people to break in through audio, or go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat.
Hi.
Hi, Dina.
Hi, I'm Dina. I think you can see me. I'm from Queen's University, and I'm actually embedded teaching and learning fellow in electrical and computer engineering at Queen's. And why I'm here, because I went through, of course, this report, and it's really, really good, but I would like also to hear from those who put it together, the things that I didn't see while I was reading. So most probably there's always something in more depth that I didn't get to. So I'm interested to hear from you guys.
Excellent. Someone else want to jump in on audio and introduce themselves? We're seeing lots of good stuff coming in on the chat too, so this is really helpful. We have such an international audience. New Zealand, Canada, Kansas. Okay, great. Well, this gives us a sense of who's here. Some of you have dedicated roles in course transformation, or working with instructors on course transformation. And some of you, it sounds like, are more faculty who are interested in working with their fellow faculty. This is really appropriate to all of those kinds of roles, although you'll have to make some adaptations depending on your particular situation. So let me sort of jump in and tell you what this handbook is about, because that informs what messages we have to share with you. So this is based on the Science Education Initiative at University of British Columbia, where Warren is, and University of Colorado, where I am. And Warren and I are two of the sort of original sets of postdocs in those two programs, and we've been around long enough that now we're writing about the program. And it's really about how to use these kinds of discipline-based education specialists, which in the handbook we call DBESs. In the SEI, we call them STFs or STLFs. So those are the positions that Warren and I originally held. And the idea is that they really, those DBESs serve as catalysts of change inside departments. So let's just introduce ourselves really briefly within that context. So we are, as I said, two of the original sets of DBESs. So I'm a physicist by training. I've been working with the Science Education Initiative at Colorado for about 10, 11 years at this point. And things have really sort of wound down with the SEI at Colorado, but we now have the Trestle Project, which is trying to continue that work. Warren, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Warren Code. I am still at UBC. I did my background is in mathematics, and I moved from some teaching assignments and things during my PhD into that postdoc role as a science teaching and learning fellow, as Stephanie mentioned. And since that time, I've joined Skylight, which is our Science Center for Learning and Teaching. So it's a center that's specifically for our science departments. And we're responsible for coordinating this initiative in its kind of last several years. So I'm still connected with the SEI, though it's pretty much wrapped up at this point. And this handbook is kind of part of that.
Right, great. And so this handbook, for those of you who know Carl Wyman's book that came out last year on the Science Education Initiative, this is more of sort of the nuts and bolts kind of how-to guide compared to Wyman's book. So they're kind of intended as sort of a pair, and it's free and online. We wrote the handbook for a lot of different people. There are a lot of different levels in initiatives like this. So I just wanted to outline that. The first part is the Initiative Leaders Handbook. So that's people who are really coordinating and running initiatives like this across several departments usually. Part two is the Department Leaders Handbook. So that would be more, say, the chair or the director within a department who is coordinating one or more postdocs or instructional designers within the department. And then the last part is the Discipline-Based Education Specialists Handbook. So the handbook for those who are on the ground doing course transformations and partnering with faculty who are doing course transformations. So that's where we're really focusing this webinar today, is on that last audience, so the people who are really the embedded experts. So just to make it clear, though, there is something in the handbook for those other two audiences. So if you or someone else holds one of those roles, please make sure to take a look at those sections too. So each of you is involved in some way as you know, based off of your introductions, I'd say that most of you are DBESs as we define them. A DBES, again, being a discipline-based education specialist. So someone who has some specialization in education within the discipline. So maybe it's physics, maybe it's engineering, but you're somehow an expert in education within that discipline. So I want to hear briefly about your role as a DBES, because these positions can have lots of different forms. This will be, I think it worked out well last time to have some people by audio and some people by chat. So while some of you are writing in the chat, some of you can be speaking by audio. Maybe I'm just going to be mean and call on people to speak up by audio so that we don't have the sort of silence of the masses, not sure who wants to speak up. So the questions I'm going to ask you to respond to are, what organizational unit are you hired into? Like, are you in the physics department? Are you in a teaching and learning center? What's the name and level of your position? Faculty, postdoc, etc. What's your background in the discipline and in teaching and learning, and what kind of training have you gotten? Those are big meeting questions, so sort of give us the elevator pitch version. So let's see, I'm going to call on somebody. How about Ryan Bano? Can I call on you?
Yeah, I guess you can. I was hoping you wouldn't pick me. I'm an educational development specialist is my title at our Teaching and Learning Center, so campus-wide Teaching and Learning Center. Let's see, what else? What's my background in the discipline? So in my role, I'm not assigned to a specific discipline or anything like that, but in terms of our Teaching and Learning Center, I am the most STEM person of the people here. My background in that is I've got a bachelor's degree in math, and I used to be a high school math and physics teacher. So that's kind of my background in that. And then education and educational technology is kind of more my teaching and learning area. And what kinds of training have I gotten at my campus that's being hired? Well, I've been working here for 6.5 years, and I guess not any specific training around that because I am our kind of person for this. So.
Excellent. So that's probably sounds familiar to some of you. Some of you are probably outside of a department and more, you know, having that disciplinary expertise and kind of reaching into departments. For those of you who aren't speaking, if you can just type briefly the answers to your questions in the chat. It's really it's always very interesting to me to see where people are coming from and how people are incorporated in these roles. I'm going to call on somebody else while we're waiting for a few people to type in. And Stephen says, yeah, that's cognitive flow, to listen and chat at the same time. So you can do what you can. So let's see. How about can I call on Sarah? Sarah Legresley Rush.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sarah Legresley Rush. I am embedded in our physics department at the University of Kansas. I am assistant teaching professor, and so what that means is I have a little bit higher teaching load than a traditional tenure track faculty does, and a smaller research load. So my background in the discipline, I actually originally started as a high school math teacher before I came into physics. So I was trained as a high school math teacher. And in terms of the training since I've gotten here, I've been here just over a year. And a lot of the training I think I've been going to is through our Center for Teaching Excellence, which Blair, who's I think helping organize this. Anyway, Blair is a big part of that Center for Teaching Excellence.
Excellent, great. So I'm going to go ahead and move on, but I would encourage you all to think about your answers to these questions, because this is such a non-traditional role that probably each of you has slightly different answers to these questions. So how do we define a DBES? Again, discipline-based education specialist. The implicit goal of a, oh, whoops, I was going to turn it over to Warren on this slide. Hey, Warren, go ahead.
Thanks, Stephanie. Sorry. Yeah, no, thank you for sharing those. And I mean, those, I mean, I can say partly that those match up partly, with backgrounds of folks that we had a few people with high school teaching backgrounds. So it was interesting to hear that more from people here. And oh yeah, this is a reveal slide, and I don't remember the order of reveals.
Oh, I can reveal them all at once.
This is our description of when we're talking about discipline-based education specialist, and kind of the perspective we had in the handbook was.
Oh, yeah. Great! I'm gonna. Looks like I'm gonna have one of those slide timing issues.
Okay.
Do you want me to just reveal them all?
Yeah, you can go ahead. Or yeah. Thank you.
I'll start with that.
Yeah, when I was when I was reviewing, I didn't have that way. So our as part of the initiatives at UBC and CU Boulder, our specialists were hired directly into the department. So the department was essentially responsible with some advising for the hiring, and people coming into these roles had a high level background in their discipline. So this was graduate school in that discipline generally, and often a PhD. Some people coming straight out of a PhD, and some people coming from a postdoc or some other kind of in-between experience in a teaching and learning project, that sort of thing. And then they would train on teaching and learning kind of background. So a really, I guess, applied focus on literature. So what are the kind of critical things that we need to know about how people learn, and then bringing that, how do we bring that into the university classroom? Generally speaking, most of these folks didn't really have a formal education background, though we did have a few kind of coming from that as well. Maybe the next, you go ahead, great. Right, so so those were kind of core features. Then we also identified some preferable features just based on, so we had about 50 of people in this, in the science teaching and learning fellow role at UBC, just by way, just to give you a sense of scale. So we found generally these really work best as full-time positions, though, there are some exceptions in terms of if someone's already based in a department, but ours were generally full-time positions at the postdoc or like a contract faculty level, and that's what we mean by instructor level. So we found that was preferable when we could manage that as opposed to the postdocs, but the postdocs also worked generally pretty well. and ideally hiring multiple specialists at once. So this can happen both, there's both kind of a within department potential. Of course, that's implying a pretty big program, but we did see sort of good synergy. You get kind of a team going within a department, but also across departments. So even if you don't have several of these specialists, having, and we definitely had several times or cases where people were the only specialist in their department. And so then it was really important to them to have this community that was sort of based across the project with specialists in the other departments. That's where they do a lot of their learning and kind of professional development.
Do you want me to bring?
Yeah,
bring
and then there's the question. It's the question comes up, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So so I'd be interesting to hear from folks if anyone had anything they'd like to share on this. So we've already heard examples that fall basically outside of this. So for example, we didn't have people based directly in the teaching center. I am now, but I'm in really more of a coordinating role. We had sort of a small coordinating unit of people that were not directly working in the departments. So it's different from what, say, Ryan's example already. So if anyone would be able to or interested to share, where do you think your position fits, and how does this match up with what you might recommend or hope to see?
If I could speak up, I'm essentially following exactly what you said in every bullet point. So I'm a teaching and learning fellow hired through Trussell, working in physics department here at Queen's University in Canada. It's a 3-year full-time position. I also teach as an adjunct and improving my own course as well as helping other faculty members in improving their courses as well. So I think overall it's been working extremely well for my own professional development as well as student learning, course improvements in my department, as well as faculty improving in teaching as well.
Awesome.
Great, thanks, Bae.
I can also add to this, to what Bae just said. We're both from Queens, so maybe our experience is the same. But I think after a while, it took us maybe more than a year and a half until I really felt that I'm part of the department and actually started to get my activities more, I don't want to say appreciated, but I understood. Because for the first year, it wasn't that clear what I'm doing, and actually it evolved into that to the extent that I didn't teach before. I was offered to teach a course which was really needed some work, so they said, okay, take it, teach it, plan it, do whatever you want, tell us what's happening at the end. So I felt that this helped being there for this long, or 2 to 3 years. I totally agree with that. I think less than that, you won't be able to do anything, but actually people started to appreciate what you're doing after a while. So yeah, I agree totally with this. The period is very important. And full-time, you have to be full-time.
Thanks, Dina. Yeah, I think that really highlights, the reason for that recommendation is because there is just so much learning, both about kind of knowledge about, course design and the science of learning and these things, but also just the context is so substantial if you're coming into a department, figuring out how everything works and getting to know people. So yeah, we found that kind of first year is really about that development, and then it really doesn't pay off that much in a way until it's so slow to kind of get going that you don't see that as much until the second year. So by the third year, we would see, people would have more maybe established like a research project and these kinds of things, but it was hard to really get everything going in the very first year. Maybe I'll add that, in more recent years when we've had, or if someone was coming into a department where like a lot of this was going on, then they were able to maybe get up to speed or kind of drop in for like a shorter term. But generally speaking, this kind of 2 to 3 years seems to be, definitely would recommend it, yeah.
I don't know if anyone else has done Peace Corps, but I was a Peace Corps volunteer many, many years ago. And back in Peace Corps, they always told us that, you know, Peace Corps lasts for 2 years, and they said, don't expect to actually accomplish anything in your first year. It's all about figuring out your local village and the local players and the power dynamics and like all of that. And I totally felt like I was doing sort of Peace Corps in an academic department when I was starting out as a teaching and learning fellow. You know, the whole, I wouldn't say I didn't accomplish anything in my first year, but it was definitely the sort of shift from learning to doing over time.
Mm-hmm. And the full time is just because it just takes that much time to kind of get going on things. If you were teaching a couple courses, you know, a semester, it would be really hard to kind of make progress on this, I would say. Yeah. Great.
Okay, maybe I'll speak up. Can you hear me?
Thanks. Sure. Yeah.
Hi, this is Stephen Keane. So I'm at Massey University, New Zealand. So my position is called educational developer, and it's a permanent position that I started early this year after 5 years of physics tutoring. So the idea is that there's a teaching and learning centre, and their new thing in the past couple of years is to have embedded educational developers in each of the 5 colleges of the university. So I'm the educational developer for College of Science, and there's one for each of the others. But I found the biggest challenge is that they've created these positions without much thought on supporting the ed developers and kind of developing their skills for the role. So for me, it's been quite a steep learning curve to learn about curriculum design and development and how to kind of build rapport with academics and kind of get things moving. So I've kind of struggled with the practical day-to-day stuff and with the lack of leadership in a way and direction.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Yeah, that is a real challenge, and I mean, to be frank, I mean that was really kind of the case here as well. I think there was not a lot known about how to, you know, help our embedded fellows operate in departments, which was part of the reason that we put this handbook together, was because it was this accumulation over time of what do people think their job is and what is the kind of development that's been helpful for them. But it was not obvious at the outset. And so I'm not sure, I guess I'm not sure where they would have gotten the recommendations for how to support. So my hope is that, you know, we have some recommendations that are helpful there.
I found the handbook very helpful.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Great. Yeah. But I can say, I guess the main idea was that, things here were not always, you know, well, it didn't get organized until we kind of learned lessons about how to do it.
Right. And I was like in the cohort of postdocs sort of as they were figuring this all out, and I was definitely sort of floundering in trying to figure out not just the expertise, but also sort of how to do that, how to coordinate all of the different pieces, how to find what I needed, you know, what my job actually was, and that's the topic of the next part of our webinar, sort of what the job can really look like. So do you want to go on to that, Warren? And Warren, you want to take the DBS role parts? You'll be on deck for a few slides here then.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good. Great. So this is, so this is, again, getting back to you folks. If you want to think a bit about these 2 prompts. So what is it that you feel like you spend most of your time doing in that role? What do you wish you could spend more time or less time doing? So we'll give you a moment to kind of think through that. And if you want to share in the chat or through voice.
while people are typing, maybe Warren, you and I can kind of just share what our answers would have been, not to distract you from your typing, but I know that I spent more time in meetings than I wanted to. Like that was a real challenge for me at our campus. We have a lot of education related, groups. And so I had trouble attending to the actual time consuming parts of the job of developing assessments and instructional materials and analyzing data because I was in meetings all the time. So that's just one example.
Yeah, I think I would probably say wanting to spend more time reading the literature, kind of broadening out kind of what I knew, because that felt like it was one of the easier things to squeeze to the side until it was like really needed. But once projects were kind of spun up, and so yeah, a lot of meetings and kind of a lot of email. Maybe that's everybody probably wishes they got to spend less time on email. I might just check the chat a little bit here. Yeah. So thanks for typing those in. Jackie says, you spend most of your time getting to know faculty and their needs, and then combing the literature. And you would like more time, maybe just in general, or maybe it got cut off. Organizing workshops. Sort of educational technology support is kind of what Bay is mentioning as part of faculty buy-in. Oh, and there's more. So again, combing the literature, possibly spending time on your own courses. So if your role, particularly for people that are in kind of like a teaching combo role, if maybe they're an existing faculty member and they've carved out time for this, or time has been carved out, that can end up being a big part of what you do. And so maybe we'll do the next slide.
Do you want me to animate these?
Sure. That's great.
That was a long list, so.
The possible duties. So I think, so I think we've highlighted some of the things that people do. I guess one of the other things to mention is that this type of work involves a lot of different things. And they're generally a lot of things that people didn't do previously in their, say, graduate school training. Even things that involve are research related, like reading and analyzing data, that can be very new because now it's generally more in the realm of, say, social science research, which is not, since we're talking primarily about STEM departments, that's not in people's background, even if they were comfortable with data analysis. But there's a lot of time spent, facilitating discussions, listening to people, kind of consulting, being kind of a mini consultant for things like educational technology. And this top item, which I kind of skipped, but supporting course transformation activities. Again, that can take kind of a broad number of things, but it means being, aware enough of things to be able to make recommendations, putting in the time in terms of meeting with faculty around, what needs to be done, and maybe carrying out things like evaluation, or partnering, working with them on their course design, what's going to happen in class next week, these sorts of things. So it's a really broad set of things. This does mean, now getting closer to the bottom of the list again, engaging in one's professional development ends up being kind of a substantial part of the role. So in that way, it kind of fits naturally, maybe with the postdoc rank for people. But it's important for wherever you come into this, kind of knowing that that's going to be a significant chunk of time. And really that doesn't stop that much because there's always kind of more to read. And so there's so much to take in. And then in terms of reporting, so we've generally found, and I think probably regardless of the role that you're hired into here, because it has this kind of support flavor, or there's generally some obligation to report up or report back, kind of how things are going. So there's a chunk of time there, and that may also be kind of a new thing for people. So there's learning to do there. So there can be learning to do on kind of all of these things.
And just coming back to, I think it was Stephen's comment from earlier about like having some level of support from the sort of organizers of these, recognizing the importance of that reporting was also something that came over time in the SEIs. Nobody clamors and begs to be forced to report their activities, but it turns out that it's very useful in focusing your efforts, seeing progress, and being able to get feedback from those central organizers as to like what kinds of where your effort might be best spent, or how what you're doing might connect to other activities. So if you're in a situation where you're struggling at all with your role or time management, or needing more input, establishing even for yourself some sort of reporting structure. For us, it was, I believe, monthly, like one-pager kind of reports, like what have you done and what are your plans for this next month, and it was very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the big, again, kind of regardless of the kind of position you have, just the acknowledgement of all this time kind of needed for learning and all these different aspects of the role is an important way to support the sort of carving out that time. In the case of the SEIs, I mean, the initial plan for these full-time positions was that people wouldn't teach because it was going to take, so there was that acknowledgement, like it would take this much time to learn. There was some teaching added, sort of occasional teaching later on the order of like one course a year, but it was still, and that was seen as partly actually because of professional development. So it's partly about being able to try out things in one's own practice. But again, just that idea of the amount of time needed for these. And then the other challenge, and maybe we'll move on to the next set. So we realized also in what we've heard from people over the years and what sort of kind of critical, or well, in terms of making space for all of these other things, it's partly about making space for them, and partly about just because people only have so much time, and it's also partly about helping people understand what the role can be. So we've generally had this, even though these specialists may take some aspects from these last listed things, where we're saying not primarily, it's not primarily one of these things. So it's not, this person is not a teaching assistant, even though they may take on certain aspects of what a teaching assistant does in supporting a course. So they may spend time in the classroom, circulating, but it's really from a perspective of, or looking at exams and that sort of thing. But it's from the perspective of, how are things going in the course? How are we going to kind of improve things? So they're looking at it from that perspective. They're not there as a course support in the same way that a teaching assistant is. Teaching, I already mentioned, so they're not meant to be only there to teach, and that's more, I would say that one's more a function of time, because there really are all these other activities that are not about being in your own classroom.
And sorry, just to break in on that, I just think that dovetails well with some of the comments for people who said that they spend a lot of time teaching it, and it's make it so they don't have as much time to support their fellow faculty. Like, so you're living that lesson.
Yeah, and one of the challenges too is that the amount that someone's doing is not that, it can be kind of invisible in a way. So that's maybe an additional challenge, is getting people to understand, oh, well, there's all these different pieces, or how much time it might take to properly kind of sort out an evaluation. So running a survey and analyzing that data, that takes a substantial amount of time. And particularly if people aren't familiar with that activity, they may not really understand. But there's also kind of just the breadth of learning and activities. So that's another place where having support from kind of a more senior people in the organization, so maybe it's department admin or the kind of more central organization, that's important too. Again, just that acknowledgement, oh, it's really a varied role. And then maybe to finish off this list, yeah, so not primarily an instructional designer, meaning because really the purpose of these roles is to for faculty to adopt practices. So it's not to kind of do it for them, and it's not necessarily the case that instructional designers always just do things for people, but it's about training, giving faculty a chance to improve themselves. So it's kind of supporting them in their course design, as opposed to necessarily, say, partnering with them on course design. And then in terms of the amount of research done, again, they're not primarily research roles. We've had people with a real range of activity on the research side. Some people really not doing very much. They were very much focused on kind of the faculty development, and then others who were kind of constantly, had research papers on the go. So it's kind of a range, but again, it can't take over from kind of the other work, which is more kind of internal facing, which is more the educational development side of things. We have a question prompt. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just pausing for a moment there, but.
Yeah, so again, we'll pause to let people, if they want to offer. So based on this, and we already had some great comments, so it's also time to check in the chat.
I'm curious, Stephen, what the implication is of being classified as professional rather than academic staff, if that restricts your access to certain things or changes your status.
I think there's sort of less emphasis on being able to do research. So it's not really in my job description at all, research or teaching. So I think it's sort of harder to make a case to carve out time to do some research. So I'm still interested in doing research and teaching. So it's kind of hard to accept that at the moment. So I would probably try and push to do more teaching research.
And when we're saying research, we're specifically focusing on education research, although I realize that some people might also have some traditional disciplinary research that they would be involved in.
Yeah.
Warren, do you want to opine on why being involved in education research is a useful part of these?
So I would say it's generally taking kind of the scholarly approach to things. So it's partly about, being an informed, consumer of the literature. And one way to kind of get at this is to, actually engage with trying to publish something and do things thoroughly enough for that, and be part of the kind of scholarly community around teaching and learning. That would be kind of the main. It's also part of kind of the broader idea that this is something we can bring into teaching and learning, which is in a way is maybe now less novel, but in sort of the university setting was kind of a new idea around, we can measure what we're doing and we can improve that way by, again, kind of being more scholarly about it. And so one advantage there with these types of roles is with that both amount of time, possibly the kind of access they can have for students different from the instructors, and then just general sort of a good connection to the literature base. These specialists can enable faculty who are interested in scholarship of teaching and learning or kind of broader projects and discipline-based education research, enabling them to kind of undertake some of that so they can so the specialists can partner with faculty who are interested in getting going on that, because they bring just more expertise on that front. Is that what you were driving at, Stephanie, or did you have more to add there?
Oh, I was curious what you would say.
Yeah.
but I also think. I also think can establish some level of credibility, which is sort of what you're saying, establishes some credibility for the scholarship of teaching and learning in general, but also some credibility for the DBES as a scholar of teaching and learning. So shall we, oh, we got a question from Jackie, and then I'll go to the next slide. Oh, actually, Jackie's question leads well into one of the later slides. So why don't we table that one for right now? But the answer is yes. So you're still on deck for this one, Warren. Shall I?
Sure. Yeah.
I've got these like one at a time. I'll just, just tell me.
So yeah, so this is, and maybe just so Jackie doesn't have to wait too long to worry about this. Yeah, so here we're talking initially about, so one of the important parts of the role is we come around at different phrases for this, but gently persuading people to consider changing their teaching. So I think the big one here, and is kind of captured in this first bullet point, so it's about meeting people where they're at. So every department has people who are experimenting in their teaching, who are trying things, and also has people who maybe want to but don't know how to get started or don't know what's possible. And so it's a whole range of people, and it means that you have to meet them where they're at. So if somebody has gone to teaching workshops at the teaching center, then you probably have a very different conversation with them than someone who hasn't, kind of regardless of how long they've been teaching. So this involves, probing a little bit, sort of just to get a sense of where is somebody at. What, how's your course going? Can be a very revealing question. When people talk about what sort of bothers them in their teaching, what are the problems in their course, that can really give you a sense of where they're at with this, and then also maybe open up kind of avenues for, what might you want to do differently. And then in terms of the kind of broader picture, but I guess, yeah, so the main thing is meet them where they're at. In terms of bringing sort of more tools at your disposal, partly it's about exposure. So this is where we talk about inviting people to classrooms. So if you can get somebody to observe somebody else teaching in a way that might interest them, that can be a really powerful experience. Unfortunately, pretty rare. It's often difficult to get people to visit one another. But beyond that, there's working with someone's own course. We've got, so the COPUS instrument, the Classroom Observation Protocol for Undergraduate STEM, is an observation tool that basically you record kind of what's going on in the classroom. So this would be you as the specialist, say, going and observing and seeing what's the instructor doing and what are the students doing over the course of that class period. And that can be a way of starting a conversation about, well, here's what's happening. Does this match up with what you thought was going on? Which is very difficult for people to gauge when they're actually the person in charge of the class. So it's another way to kind of use, here's what's happening in the class, what do you think about it, to kind of prompt reflection, or maybe there's room for suggestions. And then partnering with TAs can be another, so they're another person involved in the course that has another perspective. They may have different kinds of contact with students. And so they can often provide other kinds of kind of interesting feedback or kind of data broadly construed about what's going on in the course. Maybe the next one. Yeah. Speaking of data, yeah, so this is where I wanted to get to the idea of trying to, one of the valuable things that these specialists can do, I think is really kind of surface student voices in the course. So often faculty, and this is particularly true in, say, larger courses, the person teaching may have a pretty limited window into student kind of opinions and experience in the course. And that's, again, there's a sort of a time restriction, but there's also maybe not knowing what questions to ask. So this is another place that the DBES can kind of come in to help, asking questions about, what do students think about, or how are they experiencing this new way of teaching, or the old way of teaching, sort of, but making that available, and then bringing that to the instructor. So it's not so much about your DBES's opinion, but it's about, here's what your students are saying, and you can do it in a more maybe systematic way than would have been possible. And it's not just, the few students who are really comfortable approaching their instructor to give feedback about the course, but you can kind of reach kind of across the course potentially. And then finally, there's it's important to make teaching and learning kind of progress or examples more visible. So as I mentioned before, so there are people trying things all the time in departments, but teaching, particularly at the university, can be a very isolated practice. And so I think one of the strengths of these initiatives is it kind of built more community within and across departments around teaching and learning. So it gave more of a voice. It kind of amplified, those folks and their efforts that were already existing. So more people knew what was going on, what was possible. And then for people embarking on something new, it gives them more of a venue. And so there's different ways that this has been achieved. So there's, newsletters or, hosting talks by people. But different ways of basically just getting people in the room talking and thinking about their teaching, since otherwise it happens a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily broaden out into, say, a bunch of people in a department.
That was so the last bullet point is mostly just about not presupposing who's going to be interested from the start. Oftentimes in the SEIs we were wrong about who was going to be interested over time, and so sort of keeping an open mind as to who might come knocking on your door eventually, as well as not assuming that certain people who seem friendly to reforms are necessarily going to want to make changes to their teaching. Warren, we're getting a little closer to the end, so I wonder if we want to go to the next slide, but just have people type in the chat any questions or thoughts they have on this slide as you go on the next one. Is that okay?
I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay. Because I know this is one that's of interest.
Yeah, and so this is following. I think that we're still trying to follow on Jackie's question, really. So that was more about. So the previous slide was more about, how do you persuade people, kind of in general, and then once you're kind of engaged with someone about their teaching, we do use this word about kind of coaching. We would not necessarily use it directly with a faculty member, but in terms of thinking as a specialist, I mean, you're thinking about it as it is kind of a coaching kind of scenario, right? You're a person who's observing, bringing expertise around what people are doing, and then providing feedback on how things are going. So we found some different strategies for kind of how to accomplish this. So I kind of mentioned, observing classes, being involved in the class. So this can be as part of like a structured protocol, like COPUS, but not necessarily, but just observing classes, finding out in advance, what is it that you're trying to accomplish today in class, or what would you like me to look for when I'm observing, and then giving immediate feedback. So as soon as possible, meeting to kind of discuss that. So you get to ask the question, how do you think it went? And then talk about, well, here's what I noticed, that sort of thing. So again, opening a conversation.
And oftentimes that's just sort of like walking back to their office with them, not necessarily making, a formal appointment.
Yeah, again, and that's just really varies on the person, their schedule, their way they kind of interact. You don't want to overwhelm them with feedback. So we recommend, focus on small concrete changes. So, it might be, it seemed like people weren't answering questions. It seemed like it was really quick. I saw a couple people put up their hand, but they didn't quite get a chance because things moved on. One of the recommendations people have is to count to 10 after asking a question. It feels like a really long time, but, so there's like a concrete change to suggest. People can only absorb and try so many new things at a time. Right, and then focusing on evidence of student learning or non-learning. So this is, again, trying to bring it back to here's what we know in the course. Students are experiencing it this way, or, we ran this kind of assessment and, this is how students did. So again, it's kind of bringing it to that, think about the data and what are the implications there. So it's not just about your opinion as this specialist. Normalizing the time this takes, meaning it's basically getting people to a place where they understand that, well, this feedback is valuable. Making time for this type of kind of reflection, maybe it's like assisted reflection would be one way to think about it. That there's, get them kind of used to this. Do try to book a regular meeting if possible, but it can be short, or, that sort of walking back to the office, making that more of just a standard practice or something during that term. But trying to make it not just like a special thing that you do once in a while. And act as a cheerleader. So, it's important that people know that, they tried something and it went well. And in a way, you're in a great position to offer that kind of information. And again, that can be done through, well, both your own opinion, but also, maybe the student, raising the student voice on that.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
If you remember, like when we started out defining what a DBS is, one of the things that we defined it as is a catalyst of change. And I think that this cheerleader role is sort of an important part of that kind of mental framework of the position. If you think of yourself as trying to catalyze change within faculty and departments, then this cheerleader role becomes really important. You're the one who kind of keeps the ball rolling and is keeping an eye on progress.
Yeah, you may be the only person in the project that's sort of like organizing the project or has experience organizing like a project in teaching and learning. Even if somebody is very organized in their research program, this may be kind of new to them. Yeah.
And regardless, you're also the one who has the dedicated time, at least in theory, to do that. Do you want to pause for a discussion here?
I think we may ask people to reflect. I think we may. Sure, we'll give a minute for people to think. If you want to throw in a question or a comment there.
I think this is one of the things that people really struggle with, and this is not part of our normal professional development and learning.
Mm-hmm.
Problem with the 10-second wait time rule is that it doesn't work when people have to type in.
Yeah, it's trickier. So I will say this is a place where people who are maybe a faculty member in a department that have time carved out, this actually can be maybe trickier because it's a little more delicate, approaching some of these with a colleague perhaps. Whereas, a new person who's come into the department and everyone knows like, oh, well, that's their job to kind of observe your course and give you feedback. May actually fit a little better, but
right, yeah. When you're in the same sort of position as a colleague, it can be more delicate, I think, to get that feedback.
But as Jackie pointed, yes, faculty appreciate feedback, especially when it focuses on what the observer is seeing. Yeah, so.
Right, which is really the data that you have at hand.
Do you find the feedback someone wants is the feedback they need? That's a great question by Ryan. Yeah, so this raises a good point. So it's one of the things that you get to do as the person doing this sort of coaching is you can be selective about, what you provide feedback on. And so I think if somebody has asked you about something, even if you don't necessarily think that it's like the most important thing in changing their teaching, they've asked you to observe some aspect of their practice. I would say, I think you still want to give them feedback on that because that was what they asked for. And then you want to kind of layer on or add on, or, once you build trust, you can kind of approach other things where it actually probably matters more in terms of, say, student learning.
I agree. Remembering that admonition we had at the beginning of starting where people are at, because if they feel like you're not addressing their concerns or interests, they might tune you out from the start. So in the interest of time, this was the slide that I had as an optional slide, so I'm going to skip this slide. So there's all the stuff that I would have talked about, but there's a whole chapter in the handbook that's about course transformation. But note that we have a bunch of resources that are linked within the handbook on how to do effective course transformations and how to facilitate discussions with faculty about learning goals. So if those are things that you're doing as a part of course transformation, definitely take a look at the guide and find those downloadable handouts. So I wanted to sort of finish up with a couple of quick things. One, on some challenges that we tend to see that DBSs struggle with, and then I'll talk briefly, really briefly in the interest of time, how you can sort of support your own professional development. One thing that we had a lot of trouble with was with STFs or DBSs maintaining morale. A lot of DBSs who weren't well supported, especially in the start, either quit or wanted to quit. So that's something that's really important to address. A lot of DBSs struggle, as you guys have already said, with finding the time to publish research. And then with feeling isolated. So I think Stephen's comment on, hey, let's all chat about these issues speaks to that a lot of people in these roles are still the only person and don't have sort of a community around them. And then we also noticed that those in a postdoc position, they have some advantages because, as Warren said, they're coming in from outside, but they're also tend to be lower status and more in temporary positions, so that can be a little harder to make progress. Whereas instructors or faculty who are already within the department, as we've seen in the chat, you struggle with lack of time because you've already got a lot of duties in research and teaching, and it can be hard to get the expertise that you need to do this kind of work. So a lot of the things that we developed to really support DBSs in being successful were to address these challenges of feeling not well equipped to do the job or feeling isolated. So some of the things that we, well, actually, one of the things that's not on the next slide that we did, that we write about in the guide, is having this community of DBSs that's supported centrally. But things that you can do to really develop your own role and make sure that you're well integrated and are taken seriously. First off, to really establish yourself in your department. So if you're someone who's just being hired in, to really try to establish that credibility as a scholar of teaching and learning, as an expert in teaching and learning, learn to describe your role in an elevator pitch. If you don't have like a 2-sentence description of what you do that you can use to explain it to someone, that can really hamper your ability to just sort of have those casual conversations and have people understand what you're supposed to be doing. Another is to build relationships in the department. I know we're at time. I'm just going to finish out these few bullets here. Make sure that you have allies in the department. Make sure you've got someone who's helping to supervise your role in the department. If you're working across departments, that can be a lot harder. That's my current position as well, and I think it's harder to sort of integrate yourself if you're working across several. Teach courses, we already talked about. That helps to establish your credibility and gives you personal experience to draw from. We talked about the importance of reporting and making sure to monitor where you're at, both for your own reflection, but also to demonstrate progress to the people that you report to. And we also talked about developing your expertise in teaching and learning by going to workshops, reading literature, find people who can mentor you in this. And you know, that might be somebody who you work directly with, but it might be someone in an adjacent role in a different department or a different center. Find those people because they can, or it might be someone on this webinar who has a similar role to you, who you can draw, whose experience you can draw from. we also found it's really important to develop these time management skills, especially for the postdocs. And then lastly, again, to really engage with other people in similar roles. This was the important part of having a large body of DBSs at UBC and CU, is that we got to interact with one another and find out not just expertise in teaching and learning, but figure out how to do that job well. So once again, the URL for the handbook is up there on the top of the screen. It's got lots of advice around these, as well as sort of downloadable handouts to help support some of these roles in more detail, such as developing learning goals. And a ton of people helped us with putting this together, and so this slide just acknowledges those. We're happy to stay on for a few minutes and talk about some of these comments that are made in the chat. Sorry, we ran a little bit low on time, but just want to thank everyone for coming, and we'll start to address some of these questions in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for coming today. And yeah, I'm also will stick around. So if you have if you wanted to ask questions now, that's fine. And if you have to go, we understand.
So let's see. One common challenge I see is getting DBS to be patient with their own development. It takes time to build relationships and skills. I think that's super, super important. Yeah, and Stephen seconded that as well. We have this sort of diagram in the handbook where we kind of talk about like what a newer SDF or a DBS looks like, and what they look like as they become sort of more seasoned in their role. And it's like what I was talking about with feeling like I was a Peace Corps volunteer in an academic department. Like that first year is all about sort of figuring this out. And it's funny because, now I'm over on the other side of the mountain and know the things that I know, and I forget how long it took to develop that expertise, figure out which were the right journals to be reading, and understand the lingo and all of that.
Yeah, and I might add, because the follow-up from Stephen mentioned, yeah, it's hard to feel like a fish out of water and feeling incompetent. So there's a bit of sort of imposter syndrome kind of feelings for sure. This is a challenge because you're coming in with you have a certain background, and you're now set up possibly by whatever initiative that has put you there, or whatever funding, or somebody's made time for you to do this. So you're being set up as somewhat of an expert on this, but it may be quite new to you, and so a lot of people have this feeling. My only kind of, I don't know if it's a helpful encouragement there is, it can feel like even after you've been doing this for a while, it's like, well, I know some more things than people in my department, but there's people that know a lot more than me. I go and learn from them at the teaching center, or I see them at conferences. But I guess my response to that is, well, those people aren't coming to your department to do your job. So like it's up to you. So, and you really are the person who knows the most about this in that particular place. So it's a tricky balance, because it's hard, particularly coming from, a background where you've spent time building up, say in graduate school, to become an expert, and thinking about what an expert means in your discipline. So to kind of start over is tricky, but in a way, you kind of, like with teaching, you have to be one step ahead, but you don't have to be all the steps ahead all the time. Right.
And you probably know more than most of the people that you're wanting to work with, and recognizing that. Sarah said our university is still working on some of these positions and what roles they can play. So, again, I want to remind people that there's 2 other sections of the handbook, one for initiative leaders and one for department leaders, that look at what a department chair, what a dean, what a person who's submitting a grant to the NSF to create one of these things, what they should be looking at and what they should be thinking about. So I definitely suggest taking a look at that. Stephen has a question about financial pressure. You might be better suited to answer that, Warren.
Oh, I don't know. I think this just makes everything challenging at the university when there is sort of a pressure felt. I feel like people generally get along well enough when there's like enough money around, and then
when is that?
If that's a problem, yeah. Oh, yeah. Something you didn't think about much before. Yeah, but I mean, you get into challenges where like, oh, why are we spending money on this when we don't have enough money for, I don't know, hiring people to teach or something. So that can be a real challenge. We ended up, not exactly with financial pressure, but we had some faculty in our computer science department, which had just always trouble hiring people into these specialist roles, just because they have trouble hiring people in general. So they had some of their teaching focused faculty carve out time to become specialists. So they did the training and they worked on their own courses, a bit like other folks here described. But that didn't last much more than a year because they kind of got sucked back into just full-time teaching because the department needed that and there was not really a way around that. So yeah, so that's, so it's a real pressure.
And a related financial issue in that particular department was that the reason they have trouble hiring is because computer scientists can find many very lucrative careers elsewhere, so part of the financial, part is, it can be discipline specific, so. Great. Well, if you have any other questions that occur to you, please feel free to email either of us. Our emails are they're either in the handbook or they will be soon, but you can also Google us. We're happy to discuss any of these. Getting feedback and questions from you helps us to continue to develop the messages from the handbook. And please spread the word about the handbook because we really want to get it out there to the people who need it. So. Thanks.